So good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Jones, as you can see from the slide. I'm one of the contracting officers here. I too am a Mr., and it will become painfully obvious in the next few minutes that nobody's ever confused me with a doctor. So let's get going. The quick disclaimer, of course, the BAA, like Jacob said, is not out there yet. So if anything is said here that doesn't match what's in the BAA, go by what's in the BAA. If there's ever any amendments made to the BAA, we also post that as well. Go by whatever the latest amendment is. That's the most accurate, up-to-date version of the BAA at that time. Some of you guys might be writing down, well, when are you going to post it? And the answer is maybe in the future. And that's about as much as I can tell you at this point. We can't really give you a definitive time frame because we don't know. So don't write that question anymore. Also, other questions you may not want to write down because we're not going to answer them. Don't ask us if we think we should have small teams or big teams, or don't ask us how much money we think each proposal should be worth, because those are things we don't have any idea. So we're doing a BAA, FAR 35. What's that mean? We have a problem, and we've come out to you guys and said, hey, we need your solutions. You guys now have that great freedom and terror of putting together a solution without any kind of confines or any restrictions, no standard statements of work. So that's how come we can't tell you how big or how small something's supposed to be, because it's up to you to figure that part out. When we do post the BAA, it'll be on the Fed BizOps and grants.gov, so that tells you right there that we are allowing more than just procurement contracts. I think the indication is there that we'll probably allow cooperative agreements as well as procurement contracts. We'll go through that a little bit more if you need any more detail about that. Of course, the BAA will identify when proposals are due. There will also be an abstract phase, and it'll also indicate when those are due as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes to how to submit everything. Just make sure, though, as you're going through, if you want to find out whether or not your idea is within scope, go ahead and make sure you submit an abstract, follow the abstract format, and get it into us by that due date. So we'll give you feedback one way or the other if we think that your idea is within or outside of scope. It's always important to know that regardless of what feedback we give you on the abstract, you can still submit a proposal. If you don't give us an abstract, you still can submit a proposal. There's nothing that prohibits you in regards to that. So just keep that in mind. Of course, the BA is going to tell you exactly how to submit a proposal. It's going to lay out the format, how we want you to do that. Make sure to follow that and make sure you understand and read the BAA when it is out on the street. When it comes to eligibility, this is not a classified program, so almost anyone can submit a proposal, but it really comes down to who can we actually select and award it to when we're talking eligibility. So we are very flexible because we're DARPA, but there are some restrictions or some rules out there. We didn't make them up, but they're there that may prohibit you from being selected. So if you are a certain category of proposer or somebody who's interested in proposing, you fall under these categories, make sure you read through those sections of the BAA and submit whatever additional information we are requiring. If you are foreign organizations, just be mindful there are certain laws and rules out there that prohibit us from awarding federal money to people from countries that are that sponsor state terrorism. So I like to always say if you're from Tehran U or North Korea U, you probably shouldn't submit a proposal. It's not going to be selected. There's other rules out there, export control, other things like that, that may impact whether or not we can make an award to you. It's your responsibility to know what those rules are before you waste your time submitting a proposal. FFRDCs and UARCs, there are rules out there for you as well that prohibit you from directly competing against industry. So if you have something that is special and unique that nobody else has, you need to identify that as part of your proposal. So we can verify that you do actually not violate those rules and that you could be eligible for an award. And then there's also conflicts of interest. If you think you have a conflict of interest, if you're somebody who supports DARPA as a CETA performer, which are the people who work within the confine of the building and support government directly in the CETA roles, sometimes they come up with great ideas and they are able to mitigate and firewall the part of their company that's going to work on that. They may come into us, but then they have to verify that they can actually mitigate that conflict, and that their idea is so great that it's worth us taking the risk of there being this conflict. So it doesn't happen very often, but if you are one of those companies, that CETA companies that thinks you've got such a great idea, go ahead and submit it, but make sure you comply with the mitigation rules that we laid out in the BAA. So submitting your proposals, there's a couple things. There's 2 volumes. There's a technical and cost. The technical volume always has a page limitation to it, so make sure you go through and you read and understand what those page limitations are. We also talk about in there the margins and the fonts that we want you to use. Don't get cute and try to, use 8 or 6 font and push it out from page to edge of the page so you can collect more information within your limitation. If you try to do that, we've had people do that before, then we go in and we put you back to the normal fonts and margins as everyone else was supposed to submit it, and then we'll stop reading where the page limitation cuts off. So it's important to make sure you get whatever solution you have captured in that page limitation. Otherwise, once we reach it, we stop reading if we don't get it or if we don't understand because the rest of your solution was past that page limitation. That's going to be seen as a weakness in your proposal. There's usually an Appendix A that goes along with it, and it's mandatory, but that doesn't count towards your page limit. It has information in there we need you to fill out. It's typically information such as, is there human use, is there animal use, do you have any intellectual property restrictions, et cetera, and this is where you're supposed to identify those things. If they don't apply, simply put not applicable there so we know that you did recognize that was part of the submission, that you're supposed to answer that question for us and that you did actually, provide us an answer so we don't have to come back and clarify, is there animal use in your program. There's also a couple attachments that will be submitted with the tech volume. There's a level of effort summary by test spreadsheet. We give you a copy of that to fill out. There's also a PowerPoint summary quad chart we want you to fill out. Again, when you resubmit those to us, don't change those into other formats. Keep them in those original formats. We use that information when we're doing the evaluations and putting together our presentations to the scientific review official. There's also there's the cost volume. There's no page limit whatsoever to the cost volume. That is where, of course, you're going to provide us all your costing information. And what we ask you to include in there in the cost volume is a working spreadsheet that has your mathematics in it. It's not protected, it's not locked, it's not just a bunch of numbers, but it actually has the equations in there. We want to use that for an evaluation when we're going through, and if we want to suddenly partially select something from your proposal, we want to guesstimate and budget how much we think that's going to cost us. We want to be able to go into the tool and cut out those tasks and have it actually recalculate an accurate number for us. It also helps us later on when we go into negotiations. If for some reason we don't agree with your rates or we don't agree with the number of hours you propose for a particular task and we want to reduce those hours, we want to be able to then recalculate a counter position that is an apples to apples comparison to your actual proposal. So we need that tool. It's very vital to include that tool as part of your cost volume. What goes into each of those volumes is all laid out in the BAA. Make sure you read through it and follow it. Again, with the Appendix A, make sure to put none if there's nothing applies. Make sure to bring supplies with that worksheet. Also, just make sure when you're reading through, if you're proposing to a particular technical area, make sure you understand how all the different technical areas interact and interoperate with each other. That's important to understand as part of the project. You will be having to work with some of these other groups. So you want to make sure that your solution is also going to be operable with the other areas, or you're going to have it in your schedule how you're going to interoperate or go to the various test events within there. So make sure you put that in your proposal. Keep that in mind as you're writing up your proposals. Make sure you understand the IP rights that you can or cannot assert, and make sure you've identified the deliverables. Usually there is a list of minimum deliverables we expect. You can add to that, of course, but make sure you do address the minimum deliverables that we have laid out in the BAA. It's also important to recognize that those deliverables could vary depending upon the award instrument that you're proposing. If you're doing a cooperative agreement, we are not procuring anything under the cooperative agreement. That is an assistance instrument and not a procurement contract. So They may still want you to provide us maybe with your software that you've developed so we can test it, but we're always going to have to give it back to you. We can't keep anything like that. So just bear that in mind when you're writing these up. Depending upon the instrument that you're working with, the list of deliverables may slightly change. So you're going to write your own statements of work because there is no standard statement of work in the BAA. Couple things to bear in mind when you're writing this is, and it says BA will provide a template. That's wrong. I pulled that from the wrong slide. That was from Assist. Assist actually gave a BA template or a SAL template. We're not providing one under this. So ignore that. There's your first error that the BA will override. But when you're writing them, don't use proposal language and don't use what I call marketing language. So don't say, you know, I propose to do this or we're going to have the greatest solution ever. Don't put that kind of language in your statement of work because we're just going to have to cut out all of that and edit it when you send it to us and if you're selected. So try to write it, you know, strictly as this is what we're going to do. You know, your solution or your technical volume is really going to lay out how you're going to solve the problem. Then your statement of work is going to show us how you're going to actually execute that solution. And then, of course, your cost volume is going to lay out, here's all the resources I require to execute that solution. So those are the three things when we're looking at your proposals. You know, that's how we're kind of doing our evaluations. We're looking at those sort of, that triad there. So what's important to remember is you need to break out the work, show us the different phases of work, and the different time periods. You know, if you're going to different test events, make sure to identify those in your statement of work. Be succinct about the tasks and who is doing what, because it might be you doing part of the task, it might be your subcontractor doing part of the task, it might be the subcontractor doing all of the task. We want to know who's doing what along the way. We also want to be able to take those tasks if we're going through your proposal and we do a partial selection, and maybe we only like half the work you're doing, we want to be able to figure out what are those tasks and be able to cut that part out of your proposal when we're doing our evaluations. So it's important to be very succinct and clear about all those tasks. Again, like I said, identify the primary organizations responsible for those tasks. Make sure you have measurable milestones within there so we can tell how to measure progress and make sure that we're going down the right path. If something's going wrong along the way, we want to be able to see where are those milestones that you put in place to actually measure and determine whether or not you are doing what you said you were going to do and how you're going to maybe mitigate some of those problems. If you get up to a point in time and your solution's not working out, what is the next step? Where are you going to be able to measure that, stop the bleeding, go somewhere else? Also, don't put any proprietary information in your statement of work because these things will be cut out of the proposal and attached to the eventual award mechanism. And it'll be identified either as a statement of work if it's a contract. If it's a cooperative agreement, we might call it an RDD or a research description document. If for some reason we're allowing other transactions and you are awarded an OT, then we call it a TDD or a task description document. It's the same thing, just different names based on the different award instruments that it's attached to. But like I said, don't put any proprietary information in there because we try to cut that out and make it an attachment, and once it's attached to your contract, it is foiable. So a couple of proposal preparation tips. The Heilmeyer Catechism, learn it, know it, live it. That is what DARPA lives by. It's actually, I think, even out over by the bathrooms. It's on the wall back there, so you can go study it at the break if you want to. It's important to recognize that, you know, when program managers are pitching their program, they have to have those questions in mind. They have to be able to answer those questions. When we put the BAA, we actually identify, hey, here's a bunch of questions we want you to address in part of your proposals, which are based on these Heilmeyer Catechisms. So if you don't know what they are, go read them now and be aware that that's something you should have in your mind as you're writing up your proposal, and you should be able to answer those questions in your proposal. Another area where we see problems, substantial time commitments, is usually when you've got a PI that you're proposing who is very good. And of course, you know, we want the best, but we recognize that these guys are going to be stretched thin. And that always raises concerns from our standpoint, is how much are they actually going to be dedicated to solving our problem versus working on several other problems? And how are you going to address, or how are you going to answer our questions along the way if this guy is too busy working on other issues? So when it comes to a substantial time commitment and when you're putting together your proposal, make sure you've got that covered somehow. Whether you've got somebody in there who's your PI who can dedicate a substantial amount of time, that's great. If not, then make sure you've got some sort of co-PI or somebody else there, somebody else that we, a belly button we can push. If we've got a problem, we want to talk to somebody, make sure there is somebody there who's in charge that we can reach out to and find out the answers that we need during the project. We don't want to have, a PI and then maybe tons of grad students running around and we try to ask somebody and there's nobody there to answer our questions. That's not going to give us any confidence that you can actually solve this problem. So bear that in mind when you're writing those up, that we look for substantial time commitments from the people who are in charge. The other issue is risk. This is a DARPA hard project. We understand that there are going to be risks involved, and we want to make sure you guys understand that there's risks that are going to be involved. So make sure, and there's different areas of the tech volume, we identify and say, hey, we want you to address risk under this area. Make sure you do that. Don't leave that out. If we don't feel confident, if you understand that there are risks involved, then we're not sure you're going to be able to mitigate or solve those problems along the way. We want to make sure, like in your statement of work, where you have milestones or where you have measurable points to determine whether or not your solution is working. We want to see that kind of stuff in there. Then we also want to know what's your mitigation strategy if it isn't working. How are you going to go to plan B if plan A doesn't work? Those are the things you need to address and make sure that those are identified in your proposals to us. Otherwise, we may not feel confident or it may be determined as a weakness in your proposal that you can't solve this actual problem. Also, if you've ever done, say, some other research in this area, and that helps support how you're going to solve the problem, discuss that in a little bit more detail or show us the math. If you've done some of this work, you can show us that you have done some early research in this area, and that's how it's supporting your thought and how you're going to solve this problem. It's important that you show us that so we too can read it and have the confidence, okay, they have done this before. Now I see how they're expanding it and growing it and coming up with a solution that's going to solve this problem. And then, of course, there's always the page limit issue. That's a constant area where people complain when we're giving them feedback. That if we just given them more pages, they could have given us a better description of their solution. And unfortunately, if we gave you, unlimited amount of pages, everybody would take advantage of that, and we'd still be reading BAA proposals from day one. So we would never get anything done, and we're trying to get this stuff out the door. So we have to put some sort of limitation in there. What's important for you guys to focus in on is getting that solution described to us as quickly and as concisely as you can. One area that people sometimes fall into this trap is they spend a lot of time talking about the problem. And it's okay so that we understand that you understand the problem, but recognize too that we also understand the problem. So if you're rehashing the BAA back to us, that's a waste of time because the PM has spent many, meetings and critiqued by tons of smart people telling him what was wrong with his original idea and what he's not thinking about in his problem. He's got it. He understands the problem. He wants the solution. That's where you guys really need to focus in on, not telling him the same thing he already knows or taking his BAA and rewriting it back to him to seem like you're really smart. That's not going to cut it here. You got to do a good job of actually focusing in and going to the solution. The other area where we've seen problems is depth versus breadth. Some people will describe the solution and how it can solve tons of different issues, but we really only want to solve one of those issues. So you barely scratch the surface of why it's solving our itch. You need to go deep on us and explain how you're going to solve our problem. You can later on, after you've been selected and you go to the PI meetings, then you can talk about all those other solutions that you can solve. But if you don't get there, if you don't get selected into that PI meeting, it doesn't do you any good. So you got to focus in on what is our problem, how you're going to solve our problem, go in depth in that. Also, when you're writing these things up with the page limits, don't forget, we need you to write down your statement of work and show us how you're going to execute that solution. Don't sacrifice that. Don't forget about that. Write up the whole, your whole technical volume and then suddenly realize, oh, I don't have any room left for my statement of work. A couple other things, intellectual property rights. DARPA, especially I2O, is very big on open source solutions, which you're usually considered at that point a commercial item because there's a commercial IP license to it that then allows anybody to use it. We love that because it makes it very easy for us to transition those products down the road. We don't have to worry about the licensing to it because it's an open source license. We as the government, though, it's important to recognize a few things. One is when we pay for something to be developed, we do not own the intellectual property rights to that. We only get a license to use that. So you get to maintain ownership of that intellectual property. However, from DARPA's perspective, we usually go through the proof of concept, and then we want to transition that to another government agency, another Department of Defense, who will then harden that product and maybe turn it into a program of record. If we can't transition that very easily, or if there are significant licensing costs down the road that are going to discourage that particular agency from picking it up, that is a problem. That, that's one of those valleys of death where we try to get it from concept to actual, hardened product. If you put barriers there that are going to prevent us from crossing over that valley of death, then that might be seen as a weakness in your proposal. So bear that in mind when you're putting these together. We can't dictate what your intellectual property rights are going to be in your proposals. It's up to you as businessmen to come up with those solutions and how you're going to solve or help us solve that transition problem. We do ask, or we desire a minimum of at least government purpose rights if you're providing anything that's considered a non-commercial data, piece of data or software or something that has IP rights to it. But if you are going to provide any IP assertions in your proposal, make sure a couple things we want you to identify. A, what is the intellectual property right assertion you're providing, meaning what license are you going to give us? And the DFARS 227 has a description of the specific DoD licenses that we're looking for, which are unlimited, government purpose, and then it's either restricted or limited, or you could even write up your own special license if you had to. Beyond that, we also want you to write up in the Appendix A, if you're asserting something, how or why are you asserting that? Is it something you developed under your own dime? And if you did, where did you develop it? Was it under IRAD? Was there a special IRAD project number that you have associated with that? Or did you develop it on your own somewhere else using whatever funds or however you did it? Where did you develop that? So we can actually trace it back. Also identify specifically what it is that you're asserting. So if it's, software version 1.0, that's what we want to know. We want to know where it was developed, what's been built on top of it since then. It's important for us to sort of figure out exactly where does the IP restriction come in place in the process. And then we also want to know, is there another alternative? Is there a way that if we paid a little extra, we could get something developed for us that doesn't require your proprietary solution? Let us do the trade-off. Maybe that's something we want to consider, is spending a little more time and a little bit more money, if that'll make it easier for us to transition your solution down the road. And then, of course, anything that has an existing software license to it is something we call a commercial item. What's important to recognize there is we need a copy of that license when you submit your proposal. So it's part of Appendix A. Make sure to include any commercial IP. So if it's open source, go ahead and give us a copy of that license, or tell us the website where we can find the license. That way we can take a look at it. Not necessarily under this case, but there were cases back in the day where if we were building a military solution and we thought maybe this was going to go into a DoD system and we didn't want the software license may have said something like, okay, once you make a change to this, you got to re-release it out into the wild. And maybe we didn't want that to happen. That might have been an issue. Not necessarily nowadays, but we want to just read through those licenses and make sure there's nothing that's going to create any problems. A couple other things to note: fundamental versus non-fundamental research. So that should tell you, if any of you guys are old hats, that means this is not a basic research project, which means it's going to probably be 6.2 funded. And then that's going to create certain negotiation issues when we're putting together the awards. So what you need to remember here is, for universities, if you're performing research on campus, we're going to consider your work fundamental research. That means if you're either a prime or you're a sub, we're going to somehow in that award identify that you're doing fundamental work. That means there won't be any publication restrictions imposed on the universities. It means you could be awarded a contract. You don't have to be necessarily awarded a cooperative agreement to get the fundamental categorization. It also means if you're fundamental that there's no restrictions imposed upon you with covered unclassified information or CUI information. It means you won't have to have the websites in place or the security measures in place on your internal computer systems. Now, if you are anybody other than the university, that means you'll be considered non-fundamental, which means you won't have open publication rights, and it'll mean that there may be, depending upon what you're producing, there may be some CUI information involved, which means you'll have to protect your systems, or your systems will have to be NIST compliant. If you're not familiar with that, there is a section in the BAA, or actually if you go to our website, the DARPA website, there is a section. You can even pull up an old BAA, and this language is in all of them. You click the link and it'll talk to you about CUI, all the new DFARS regs that are out there about CUI, and those go into the NIST compliance regulations, et cetera. So be mindful of that. If you're a prime who is a non-university and you've got a university sub, be mindful that you're going to have to be careful with how you share information back and forth, because yours might be considered CUI. They may not have a CUI compliance system. So those are the little tricks you just got to be mindful of as you're putting together your proposals. This program will also have associate contractor agreements put in place. That's something also you need to be mindful of. If you're not familiar with those are agreements that everybody sort of signs up to and says, hey, in order to make this interoperable system work, we're going to have to share some information amongst each other, or when we go to the PI meetings and we're all there together, we're not going to release other people's information. So everyone can then work together to collaboratively come up with an ultimate solution for us. Be careful, of course, as that information is being passed, you want to make sure that as a university, you're not somehow getting CUI information, taking it home, and now you have to make your system CUI compliant with the NIST requirements. So again, these are just little nuances and rules you just got to be mindful of when you're putting together your teams, you're putting together your proposals that may come down the road. You'll have to address it some way or the other. So just keep that in mind. A couple other things when it comes to subcontracting. If you are putting together your proposal, and you're over certain dollar thresholds, you may have to put in a subcontracting plan if you're not a small business that's putting together the proposal. Make sure you have that plan included as part of your cost volume so that it doesn't impose on your page restrictions. But if you put together that subcontracting plan and you have a small disadvantaged business goal that is not greater than 5%, then address in your plan somewhere why you weren't able to achieve that goal. And then anybody, regardless of your size of business or your organization, if you do have subcontracts as part of your proposal, you're using subcontractors, whether it's university, nonprofits, for-profits, et cetera, make sure that you include a copy of their proposal to you in your cost volume. Don't give us ROMs or don't give us estimates of what you think your subs are going to be. We want to see firm proposals from them. And we recognize they may only give you a sanitized, I call it, proposal that won't show their proprietary information. It may just give rolled up rates. It doesn't show the individual labor and indirect rates, et cetera. That's fine, because we recognize they won't give that to you because they don't want to share their proprietary information. What we do ask, though, is that you make sure that either they email that to us directly with your proposal or before the cutoff date. If they don't, it's not the end of the world, but if you are selected, then we're going to contact you and immediately say, hey, make sure those guys send us that information up front so we can start doing our evaluations. If you're using any sort of FFRDC, UARC, any of those other institutions or organizations that we identify that may have potential restrictions on them, make sure that you identify and provide that information that proves they're eligible to receive a subcontract and funding from us. A couple of quick things. The minimum is usually 120 days. The BAA may say something different. I suggest you give us more than 120, give us 180 days or even more. TFIMS 2 will be required. There's certain formats you got to put your documents in, and of course you have to write them in English. Submission process, okay, there is two things. You've got an abstract, and then you've got your proposal submission. Abstracts are all going to be submitted using the tool, the BAM tool. If you are not familiar with that, and you don't have an account set up, go ahead and set it up right now. Whether or not you're going to submit an abstract, just go ahead and get it done. You don't want to wait for the last second to try to do that because it's a two-step process. And if you're messing around trying to get that thing done and the submission time frame passes, then you're out of luck. So go ahead. It doesn't cost you anything. Go ahead and do it now. Get your account set up, get your password. If you haven't been in there in a while, you still have an account if you've been in there once, but your password may have expired. Again, don't wait for the last second to get your password updated. These are just does that you should be doing. So get that in place now. Don't wait for the last second. Once you get your abstracts into us, and it's usually roughly about 2 weeks from when the BA hits the streets is when we ask for the abstracts to be submitted. We get those. It takes about a week usually for us to turn them around, depending upon how many we receive, et cetera. They give you feedback. They'll send you a letter or an email that says, hey, we like your idea. It's in scope. Great. Or, nah, it's not in scope. Here's why. And then they'll give you some feedback as to some of the problems. Again, once you get that feedback, it's up to you to decide whether you're going to still pursue that or not. There's nothing that prohibits you from still submitting a proposal. And a lot of people sometimes take that opportunity to then improve and give us a better proposal than what they originally thought they were going to give us. So when it comes time to submitting your proposal, if you're going to submit a proposal for a cooperative agreement, you're going to use the grants.gov website because that's set up for all the assistance instruments. Anything else, if you're proposing anything else, then you're going to go again through the DARPA portal system and submit your proposal that way. A couple things to recognize is that it has a size limitation of 50 megabytes. Usually what you do is you're going to put your files in a zip folder and upload the zip folder that way. Couple things that have happened lately, be mindful. A, when you put the files in there, make sure that's the actual file that you want to submit for that BAA. We don't, if you submit the proposal solution for Stowe's BAA, that is not going to be evaluated by us. So we're going to reject that, or when we see it, it's going to be, sorry, that is a non-responsive proposal to our BAA. And we're not going to forward it to Stowe. So if Stowe's waiting for it, sorry, you sent it to the wrong guys. So make sure you put the right BAA proposal in your package, submitting it to IDAS. Make sure it's the IDAS solution and not somebody else's. The other thing is also make sure that those files actually make sense. Sometimes they get garbled. You want to just double check. Make sure you've given us all the actual documents we've requested. That way, at least we kind of see you tried to give it to us and it messed up, then maybe we can go back and say, hey, we saw that you gave us like 3 of the files that made sense and one was garbled or corrupted. Can you resubmit that one? We'll let you clarify your proposal that way. But if you don't give us some of those items or whatever you give us is all messed up, then that could be a problem. So just make sure you understand how to zip files properly and put it in the system as we have required. Also, when you're putting your solution in your proposal in the tool, make sure to finalize it. If you put it in there, walk away, maybe you put it in there a week in advance and you're waiting for the last second to submit because you're just that crazy, and you forget to hit the finalize button, it never actually submits to us. It's lost in limbo. We can't see it. We'll never acknowledge that we've received it. So make sure to finalize it. If you're using grants.gov, good luck. I don't have any control over that system, and that's up to you to figure that one out. It's important when we say don't wait for the last minute, we really mean don't wait for the last hour. I don't know what happens in that magical last hour that people think their proposal went from bad to great, that they have to then get it into us in the last few minutes before the system shuts down. Inevitably, somebody runs into a problem in the last 15 minutes because they started at 16 minutes before the cutoff, and they start running into problems, or they forgot that they needed to update their password, or they hadn't set up their account yet, and they're trying to do that in the last 15 minutes, and then at 12 and 1 second, they try to submit their proposal to us, and then the system shuts them down, and they tell us, your system isn't working, I can't get my proposal in. And that's not true. The system is working, because at 12 o'clock, it shuts you out, and will not let you submit anything past that time frame. So don't wait for the last hour to try to get us your proposal. It doesn't give you any advantage dropping it off at the very end. It's not like we pick them off the top of the pile if you dropped it in last. You can get it into us ahead of time. You can get it into us a day ahead of time. There is no restriction about how early you can get it to us. But if you don't get it to us before that, whatever day it is, 12 o'clock noon Eastern time, then you're out of luck. So if you're not familiar with how we evaluate, quickly, the scientific review process, we take all the BAA proposals that come in, divide them up, and then an individual reviews each, or not each, but usually they get a couple of proposals, but they individually look at a proposal and compare it to the evaluation criteria that are laid out in the BAA. We have 3 standard criteria that are in all our BAAs, and we'll probably use that for this one as well. I don't think there's going to be any additional ones. If you want to get a jump start and see what those are, just go pull one of the other I2O BAAs, go to the evaluation criteria, and they're laid out right there. So you can start thinking about, how we're going to evaluate it right now. They go through the evaluation process. People do write-ups. They determine the strengths and weaknesses of your individual proposal, make recommendations. The program manager then summarizes which ones are selectable. From the pool of selectable proposals, he then recommends which ones he thinks he wants selected based on his portfolio and how much money he has, how much all the different proposals cost. Scientific review official then selects and makes the selection of all those proposals. At that point, then, once the selections are made, then we'll reach back to you and tell you whether or not your proposal was or was not selected. Or if we do reach back to you and tell you that you're selected, and we might say, hey, it was only partially selected, but we need you to revise your proposal, come back to us in 2 weeks with an updated cost volume based on cutting out X and Y task, etc. So at that point, you're going to hear from us whether or not you've been selected. If you're not selected, then you're given an opportunity to call in for feedback, and they'll give you a one-on-one kind of, hey, here's what was wrong with your proposal, or here are the weaknesses we found in your proposal, here's the strengths. They won't go into any other details, though, about the program. They're not going to talk about the number of proposals they received. They're not going to talk about other people's proposals or other solutions that they have. All that stuff is still source selection sensitive. They're just going to give you feedback to how to improve your particular proposal. So right now, the communication process is, we're hoping to get the BAA out there so you guys can then read it. Once it's out there, if you guys have questions, you can feel free to contact the program manager. Again, the key thing, though, is to get the abstracts into us. The program managers are very busy during this process, so they've set aside this abstract process for you to submit, and they can give you the feedback directly on your solutions at that point. But communication is open. We want to make sure everyone understands how to submit a proposal. We want you guys to get us as many proposals as possible. Once the proposals come in, the only communication from that point forward will be the contracting officer potentially reaching out to you if there's some sort of clarification required of your proposal. But as we're going through the scientific review selection process, we won't be discussing anything with you. It usually takes us 30 to 45 days to go through that, get it done. Soon after that, then roughly 45 to 60 days, you should hear back from us with selection letters one way or the other. So once you get the selection letter, like I said, if you are not selected, you get an opportunity for feedback. If you are selected, then usually the contracting officer will contact you next, engaging with you with discussions, clarifications of your proposal, negotiations, whatever, until we come to an award. If for some reason during that process we can't come to a reasonable settlement, a reasonable agreement, then we may not actually award you your proposal. We reserve the right throughout the whole process. We may select none of the proposals that we receive. We may select some. We may select all. If we get them, we may not actually negotiate. We may break them down into smaller tidbits, etc. So we have a lot of flexibility on what we're going to do. Takeaway right now is make sure if you haven't registered for the BAM tool, go ahead and do it now. Get that done. Be ready to read that BAA as soon as it hits the street. You can start reading other BAAs if you want to if you've never dealt with us before, you want to kind of see what the evaluation criteria look like, how to lay out the format of your tech volumes, etc. Make sure you understand government IP terms. Go ahead and read DFARS 227. That's, it's a kick in the pants. So go ahead and start reading that now. Make sure you got it and understand it. Make sure you got those spreadsheets ready. If you don't know how to put a spreadsheet together, go ahead and take a class right now. Get that done. Be ready to submit your proposals or your abstract as soon as we request them, and then your proposals will usually be roughly 60 days after when the BA hits the street. And then finally, just remember this, that when you're in negotiations, if you've been selected, or after you've submitted your proposal, if you have any questions, or if somebody reaches out to you that is not a government contracting officer, if it's not myself or Jennifer Mack from CMO, then you shouldn't be talking with them. The only people you should be talking with during this process, definitely the contracting officer. If after you've been selected, maybe there's some technical solutions that need to be worked out, because we've maybe taken part of your selection and we're still talking to you about it, it's okay for the program manager to then talk to you on a technical basis. But it's important to recognize that any sort of technical discussions that may impact your costs, you pass that information back to your contracting people so they negotiate it with the government contracting people, so that when it comes time for the final award, we've got everything down, all the costs match what the final technical solution is in that statement of work. But it's always important to remember that the contracting officer is the only person who is obligated can obligate the government. So the program manager can make promises all he wants, but if you don't have that contracting officer on board, then you're going to have problems. So just make sure throughout this process that your contracting people keep the contracting officers informed and involved. And with that, that's the last of my presentation. If you guys have any questions, put them on the pieces of paper and they'll collect them in the back.